Imagine, dying, right? Shedding your mortal coil, crossing the veil into this ultimate ethereal spiritual plane of existence.
Right, the grand afterlife.
Exactly. And then you spend eternity sitting on a bucket with a literal fishing rod in your hand, just waiting for a celestial trout to bite.
Yeah, that is, it's a jarring image, isn't it?
It really is. But according to the material we're diving into today, that is exactly the kind of absurdity you end up with when you take ancient mystical metaphors and, try to forcefully cram them into a literal physical framework.
It's just wild, the juxtaposition there of ultimate spiritual liberation with the mundane mechanics of baiting a hook.
Right.
But honestly, that perfectly encapsulates the central tension we are unpacking today. We're looking at what is essentially a masterclass in reading comprehension.
Yeah, specifically how the human brain processes ancient texts.
Exactly. And the core argument here is that stripping away the metaphor doesn't make these texts more real. It actually neuters them.
Right, it turns poetry into this, deeply confusing instruction manual. So, welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to decode one specific omnipresent symbol found across ancient texts, and that is water.
The big one?
Yeah, the big one. And we are going to look at a highly detailed, brilliantly provocative lecture that just completely dismantles the literal interpretation of this symbol.
Because when you insist that ancient writers were talking about literal H2O, you don't just, miss the theological point.
No, you create a whole mess.
You really do. You create this cascade of geographical impossibilities, biological horrors, and just logical paradoxes.
Which is why I think this discussion transcends any specific religious framework, right?
Yeah.
Because whether you approach these texts as a believer or maybe an atheist or just someone fascinated by literature, this is for you.
Oh, absolutely. The mechanics of how we extract meaning from words, that remains the exact same no matter your background.
Yeah, and the text we are analyzing today, it really forces us to look in the mirror and ask why we so desperately want these ancient allegories to behave like modern encyclopedias.
Right, like we need them to be Wikipedia pages.
Exactly. So let's jump straight into that celestial fishing trip because the imagery is just too good to pass up.
It's hilarious.
So the analysis begins right at the end of the biblical narrative, looking at the book of Revelation, specifically chapter 22.
Where it presents this incredibly famous grand invitation.
Right, a call to come and take the quote-unquote water of life freely.
And to a reader who is engaging with the text on a literary or, mystical level, this is the ultimate culmination of spiritual fulfillment.
It's the goal.
Right. It is the archetype of the soul finally finding its source. But the critique we are looking at highlights how this profound imagery just gets dragged down into the mud of literalism.
Yeah, and the speaker recounts this genuinely hilarious anecdote about a pastor who claimed to have received a vision, like a literal dream of heaven.
And in this dream, heaven is basically an extremely high-end resort with zero infrastructure issues.
Totally. The pastor describes streets paved with actual gold bullion, this pristine, quote-unquote, sea of glass that is perfectly hygienic.
And the crowning detail, which is just incredible.
Oh, it's the best part. Peter, one of the primary disciples, is literally sitting on the shore of this celestial sea, casting a line to catch fish.
Because, of course, Peter was a fisherman in his earthly life.
Right, and famously, he was told he would become a fisher of men.
Yeah, but this dream takes that sweeping metaphor about, gathering souls or spreading a philosophy and completely hollows it out.
It just hands the poor guy a literal fishing pole for the rest of eternity.
It is almost tragic when you really think about it.
It is. You achieve cosmic enlightenment, and your reward is just an endless loop of your old day job.
Yeah, and the critique expertly dissects exactly why this is logically bankrupt. It requires a complete categorical failure regarding what a spiritual realm even is.
How so? Break that down for us.
Well, think about the fundamental nature of physical water, what it actually does in a biological system.
Okay, so it hydrates cells, right? And it washes away physical debris.
Exactly. It prevents biological death, and it maintains physical hygiene. Now, try to port those functions into a theoretical, immortal, spiritual plane.
Oh, I see.
By the very definition of this space, you lack a carbon-based biological body.
Right. You don't have cells that need hydration to stave off necrosis.
No, and you do not secrete sweat. You don't walk on dirt paths that require you to bathe. The underlying physical problems that H2O solves simply do not exist in that dimension.
They're irrelevant.
Completely. Therefore, insisting that the water of life is just this exceptionally pure form of physical water isn't just missing the point. It is an ontological contradiction.
It's like forcing an earthly solution onto a place that doesn't even have the problem. Like, thinking a firewall on your computer requires actual asbestos.
That is a perfect analogy, yes.
It's just a category error. So if you don't have biology, you don't need hydration. So if we accept that the text is undeniably metaphorical, what is this water of life actually representing?
Well, the analysis introduces this incredibly visceral counter-concept of quote-unquote dirty water. And this is where the theological payload really drops.
Okay, I'm listening.
If water is a metaphor for the input that sustains your inner life, then you have to evaluate the quality of that input. The analysis uses the analogy of sewage, or water heavily contaminated with industrial oil.
Gross, but okay.
Right. In physical reality, if you are dying of thirst and you drink raw sewage, you don't quench your thirst.
No, you introduce a pathogen. You accelerate your own destruction.
Precisely. In this framework, dirty water represents false teachings, corrupted doctrines, or, and this is the irony, the very act of reducing a profound spiritual truth into literal nonsense.
Wow. So absorbing false teachings is literally like washing with sewage.
It is. Consuming that kind of ideology is the psychological equivalent of washing your face with contaminated water. It degrades your intellect. It makes your internal world sicker.
So the water of life isn't a magical tap in the sky. It is the pure, unadulterated truth that resolves existential thirst.
Exactly. It's the difference between true comprehension and intellectual degradation.
Which completely reframes how you read these ancient documents. If consuming the wrong water means corrupting your own operating system, then reading these texts literally isn't just like a harmless eccentricity.
No, not at all.
It is an active consumption of dirty water.
It is intellectual self-sabotage. And to prove just how pervasive this self-sabotage is, the analysis doesn't just linger on the vision's revelation, it flips back to the very beginning.
Right, Genesis.
Yeah, to show that this categorical error regarding water starts on page 1.
Oh, this brings us to the cosmology of the ancient Near East, specifically the concept of the waters above and the waters below.
Plus, the firmament.
And I just have to say, the rhetoric used in this part of the analysis is fantastic. It takes a literal sledgehammer to the physics of Genesis chapter 1.
It really does. It addresses the description of the firmament, which is supposed to be this dome separating the terrestrial water from an alleged cosmic ocean suspended in outer space.
Which is a wild thing to picture.
Right. And what is so effective about the speaker's approach here is the strategic use of humor and self-deprecation. They refer to people who still harbor this belief of a literal sky ocean as quote-unquote ignorant old men and women.
But then they jokingly include themselves in that. They call themselves little old man.
Exactly. They openly admit to having once been trapped in that exact same literalist paradigm.
It's a brilliant way to disarm the audience. Like, it's not an attack from above. It's a shared realization of past foolishness.
Yeah, but then comes the logic trap regarding the flood narrative, and it is just devastatingly simple.
Oh, the logistics of the flood.
It relies on basic mass and volume. The premise is this. If you believe in a literal firmament holding a literal ocean of H2O in outer space,
Right.
and you believe that during the narrative of the Great Flood, the quote-unquote windows of heaven physically opened and dropped all of that water onto the earth for 40 days.
Where did it go?
Exactly. Where did it go?
It is the ultimate logistical nightmare. If an ocean large enough to submerge the highest topographical peaks on the planet suddenly crashes down, the Earth physically cannot contain that volume of mass without fundamental planetary disruption.
It would destroy the sphere.
Right. And even if we grant the magical arrival of the water, the receding of it is an even bigger physics problem. Where does it drain? You can't just pull the plug on a flooded sphere.
The literalist interpretation forces you to invent endless, untextual, magical mechanisms to explain away the physics. Like, did it evaporate back into the vacuum of space?
Did the Earth suddenly expand its subterranean caverns?
Exactly. The moment you ask a single physical question, the literal interpretation collapses under its own weight.
But the analysis points out that the geographical nightmare doesn't end with the flood. It actually gets much more specific and, frankly, much more absurd when it examines the topography of the Garden of Eden.
Ah, the 4 rivers. This is where literal cartography goes to die.
Yes, the text clearly states that a single, unified river flows out of Eden, waters the garden, and then branches off into 4 distinct headwaters.
The Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates.
Right. Now, anyone with a basic grasp of geography knows the Tigris and Euphrates are fixed, very real entities.
They define the cradle of civilization in Iraq, in Mesopotamia.
But the juxtaposition of those two rivers with the Pishon and the Gihon is what tears the literal map to shreds.
Because based on ancient geographical traditions, the Gihon is deeply associated with the region of Africa, often linked conceptually to the Nile system.
Right.
And the Pishon is traditionally associated with regions stretching toward India or the deeper Arabian Peninsula.
So we're talking about massive hydrological systems separated by deserts, seas, and tectonic plates.
Thousands of miles.
And the literal reading demands that they all originate from one singular physical spring in a garden.
The triumphant conclusion drawn here is inescapable. You cannot have rivers spanning Africa, Mesopotamia, and the Indian subcontinent flowing from a single origin point. It defies all continental topography.
You know, it's funny. When you look at the lengths people go to defend this, you see arguments bordering on the desperate. Like you'll see attempts to retroactively apply plate tectonics.
Oh, I've seen that.
Arguing that maybe during Pangaea, millions of years ago, these rivers somehow connected before continental drift pulled them apart.
Which is just an incredible display of missing the literary part entirely. It applies modern geological theories to Bronze Age poetry.
Right.
But even if we entertain that, it ignores the primary function of why the ancient authors wrote it that way. The analysis argues that if Eden were a set of literal GPS coordinates, you wouldn't need any kind of moral or spiritual transformation to attain it.
You could just fund an expedition.
Exactly. Hike up the Euphrates and eventually stumble upon the Tree of Life. It would be a matter of cartography, not enlightenment.
So the geographical impossibility isn't an error. It's a deliberate, flashing neon sign to the reader. It's the author telling you, stop looking at the dirt. This is a map of the interior human landscape.
Yes.
The four rivers spreading to the corners of the known world represent the universal diffusion of truth, not a geological survey.
Precisely. When the physical reading breaks down so spectacularly, it forces the intellect upward. It demands a metaphorical reading.
So if the celestial water isn't physical and the subterranean water isn't physical, it forces us to reevaluate the water that falls between them, the rain.
And this is where the argument shifts from cosmology to daily lived reality. The analysis moves into the book of Deuteronomy, examining the ancient agrarian mindset.
You have to put yourself in their shoes for a second.
Yeah.
If you are a subsistence farmer in the ancient Near East, rain is quite literally life and death.
It is the ultimate currency. And the text in Deuteronomy presents what appears to be a very stark transactional meteorological promise.
Right. It says if the community obeys the divine commandments, the quote-unquote early and late rains will fall and the harvest will be plentiful.
But if they disobey, the heavens will be shut, the earth will turn to iron, and they will face starvation.
On its face, it reads like a direct threat of ecological manipulation based on moral compliance. But the analysis introduces a thought experiment here that completely shatters that surface-level reading.
It's beautifully absurd, this thought experiment.
Walk us through it.
Okay, it asks you to visualize a micro-interaction. Imagine a deeply faithful Jewish individual, meticulously observing every tenet of the law. They are sitting outside, sharing a meal at a table with a pagan Roman soldier who is completely ignorant of or even actively hostile to those same laws.
So they're occupying the exact same physical space, like 2 feet apart at lunch.
Right. If we apply the literal transactional reading of Deuteronomy, what happens when a storm rolls in? Does the atmospheric pressure recognize moral boundaries?
Does the rain cloud isolate itself?
Exactly. Does it hover exclusively over the faithful individual, drenching them in agricultural blessings, while an invisible force field keeps the Romans sitting across the table perfectly dry?
It's Looney Tunes physics. It's
Yeah.
literally a cartoon storm cloud tracking one specific character.
Yeah.
When you force the text into a meteorological framework, you end up with a universe that operates on magical, highly selective, localized weather phenomena.
And the absurdity of the thought experiment is the point. It reveals the true syntax of the ancient metaphor. In this textual ecosystem, quote-unquote, rain is not H2O precipitating from condensed atmospheric vapor.
No.
Rain is doctrine. It is teaching. It is the dissemination of insight and spiritual blessings.
Which fundamentally changes how you interpret divine punishment in these texts. If rain equals knowledge, then a drought isn't a lack of water.
Exactly. The analysis draws a connection to Revelation chapter 11, where 2 witnesses are given the power to shut the sky so that no rain falls for 3.5 years.
A literalist reads that. and sees a global ecological disaster where billions of people die of physical dehydration.
But a physical drought is indiscriminate. It kills the righteous and the wicked equally. It doesn't target the conscience, it targets the kidneys.
That's such a good point.
Which is why it must be metaphorical. Stopping the rain means a cessation of life-giving truth. It is a period of intense spiritual famine.
So it implies a societal state where no new insight is generated, no deep teaching is offered, and the culture is left in a dry, arid state of profound ignorance.
It's a judgment on the intellect and the soul, not the soil.
So we've systematically dismantled the literal interpretation of cosmic oceans, geographical rivers, and atmospheric rain. But the analysis doesn't stop at the macro level.
No, it zooms all the way into the micro.
Right, if water from above is a metaphor for the influx of truth, what happens when humans try to use physical water down here to wash ourselves? This brings us to the critique of religious rituals.
Yes, the transition from cosmic metaphor to personal hygiene. The analysis aggressively deconstructs the literal execution of two foundational rituals, foot washing and baptism.
Let's start with the foot washing, which is drawn from John 13.
Yeah.
The standard narrative is that Jesus humbled himself by washing the feet of his disciples.
It's held up as the ultimate act of servant leadership.
But the speaker approaches this text not as a theologian, but almost like a forensic investigator looking at a crime scene timeline. They point out a massive, glaring behavioral anomaly.
The hygiene paradox.
Exactly. The text explicitly states that this foot washing happens after the evening meal was already underway, or depending on the translation, concluded. Now think about the cultural and historical reality of the first century Middle East.
You are dealing with an arid environment, unpaved roads, and open footwear. The accumulation of dust, dirt, and animal refuse on the feet was a daily, unavoidable reality.
Right. And you are eating at a triclinium, which is a low table where you are essentially reclining on the floor, meaning your feet are in very close proximity to the food and the other guests.
So in that context, basic human hygiene dictates that you wash your feet before you sit down to eat.
To wait until the meal is over, or halfway through, to wash off the accumulated filth of the road is practically a violation of sanitary norms. It makes no logical sense as an act of physical cleaning.
Which implies the act was never about the dirt on their skin. But what blew my mind in this part of the analysis was the cross-cultural reference.
Oh, the Buddhist text.
Yes. The speaker points out that this exact same chronological anomaly, washing feet after the meal, appears in the Diamond Sutra with the Buddha.
That is a critical connection.
Yeah.
Because it demonstrates that this specific sequence of actions is not just a quirky historical detail of one particular Galilean dinner party.
No, it is an established, recognized literary motif across vastly different ancient wisdom traditions.
So what does it mean?
Well, the act of washing the lowest part of the body, the feet after consuming the meal, which represents the intake of teaching, is a profound archetype. It represents the integration and application of the truth to the lowest, most foundational aspects of how you walk through the world.
Oh, wow. But the tragedy, as the analysis points out, is how modern institutions completely ignore the archetype and just recreate the theater. The speaker really takes the gloves off here, heavily mocking modern leaders who perform this ritual literally.
The performative humility of it all.
Yes. The analysis specifically calls out political figures. Like, they mentioned former South Korean President Park Geun-hye, who would publicly wash the feet of constituents or ministers.
It's political theater. It's an optics game.
You pour tap water on someone's foot, dry it with a towel, cameras flash, and you get to claim the mantle of ultimate humility without actually having to change a single internal policy or confront your own ego.
It is the ultimate commodification of a metaphor. You substitute the arduous, painful process of internal transformation for a 5-minute photo op with a basin of warm water.
And that critique flows perfectly into the analysis of literal baptism, which the speaker basically treats as a logistical tragicomedy.
The logistics of mass literal baptism really are absurd when you think about them outside of a controlled modern church environment. The analysis uses the example of trying to execute this ritual in Manchuria, in Dongbei, during the dead of winter.
Right. If the theological mandate is that salvation or spiritual cleansing strictly requires full bodily immersion in a flowing river, what is the protocol when that river is under 2 feet of solid ice and the ambient temperature is sub-zero?
Do you boil the river? Do you just put a pause on salvation until the spring thaw? Do you risk hypothermia and death to check a religious box?
The speaker highlights how these physical constraints force institutions into increasingly absurd workarounds.
You see the degradation of the symbol in real time? Because you can't freeze your congregation to death, you compromise. You move indoors.
You swap the flowing river for a heated tank.
Or you abandon immersion entirely and decide that flicking a few drops of municipal tap water onto a forehead suffices. It raises the ridiculous question, what is the exact volumetric requirement of H2O needed to validate the soul?
And it gets worse. The analysis points to the absolute lowest common denominator of this literalism, mass baptism drives. The speaker talks about historical instances where villagers or kids were lured into the water with bribes of chocolate or instant ramen.
It reduces a supposed cosmic transaction to a transaction of instant noodles. Let me mutter this incantation and splash this water on you, and here's your snack.
It completely divorces the ritual from the intellect.
Which brings us to the actual definition of the ritual found in 1 Peter. The analysis synthesizes this perfectly.
What does Peter actually say?
The text explicitly clarifies the metaphor. It states that this baptism is not the removal of dirt from the physical flesh. It is an appeal to God for a clear conscience. The washing is entirely internal.
Oh, so when Jesus tells Peter in John 13, he who is bathed needs only to wash his feet but is completely clean, he isn't giving him a dermatological assessment.
Yeah.
He's saying, your mind has received the paradigm. Your core is clean.
The overarching tragedy the analysis exposes here is the massive misallocation of human energy. People will spend endless hours arguing over the correct physical technique immersion versus sprinkling, frontward versus backward, fresh water versus salt water.
They will organize massive logistical events, build specialized architecture, and endure freezing temperatures.
All to execute a physical pantomime while their internal conscience remains entirely unexamined and unchanged.
We do this all the time, don't we?
Yeah.
We prefer the physical ritual because the internal work is terrifying.
Yeah.
Changing your mind, admitting ignorance, completely rewiring your worldview, that is agonizing.
But having someone dunk you in a pool is easy. It's the path of least cognitive resistance.
So we have thoroughly established the uselessness of washing the outside of the body with literal water. But the text forces us to go deeper. What happens when the metaphor moves internally? What happens when the narrative asks us to drink the water?
This transitions us to one of the most famous encounters in ancient literature, the story of the Samaritan woman at the well, found in John 4.
And I have to say, the way the analysis deconstructs this narrative completely blew away my preconceived notions. Because if you read it purely literally, ignoring the cultural and literary subtext, it sounds incredibly awkward. It almost reads like an ancient, clumsy romantic comedy.
It really does. But to understand why it reads that way, we have to establish the severe socio-political tension of the setting. You have a Jewish man sitting by a well in Samaria, initiating a conversation with a local woman.
The text mentions casually that Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. But that's a massive understatement, isn't it?
It's a profound understatement. The animosity between Jews and Samaritans was deeply entrenched, fueled by centuries of ethnic, religious, and territorial disputes. They considered each other fundamentally impure.
They hated each other.
Yeah, they wouldn't share drinking vessels, they wouldn't eat together, they certainly didn't engage in casual, friendly banter at public utilities. The speaker in the analysis compares it to the modern equivalent of Christians and Buddhists physically fighting, or a radical orthodox believer of one sect trying to strike up a cheerful conversation with an extremist from a warring faction.
It simply defied all social protocols.
But it's not just the ethnic tension. The analysis points out a crucial literary device that ancient readers would have recognized immediately, but modern literalists completely miss the well as a type scene.
Yes. The betrothal motif.
Explain that for the listener because it's so important.
Well, in the ancient Near Eastern literary tradition, when a man travels to a foreign land and meets a woman at a well, it means a wedding is coming.
It's a setup.
Exactly. Isaac's servant finds Rebekah at a well. Jacob meets Rachel at a well, waters her flock, and kisses her. Moses flees to Midian, defends Zipporah at a well, and marries her. The well is the ancient narrative equivalent of a singles bar.
It is the established stage for courtship in the Hebrew imagination. So when Jesus, a Jewish stranger, sits at this specific stage and starts asking this Samaritan woman for a drink, the analysis correctly points out that to her and to the ancient reader, it sounds overwhelmingly like an overture.
It sounds like he is hitting on her.
It sounds like a pickup line.
And the dialogue just gets stranger if you keep reading it literally. After asking for a drink, he suddenly pivots and says, "Go call your husband." And she says, "I don't have a husband." And he responds, "You're right, you've had 5 husbands, and the guy you're with now isn't your husband."
It's so invasive.
If someone tried to use that as a pickup line today, you wouldn't just walk away, you'd call security.
The analysis highlights the absurdity of the literal dialogue to prove a point. If you read this as a historical transcript of a thirsty man trying to get a physical drink of H2O, the interaction is erratic, invasive, and completely nonsensical.
But the narrative hinge happens when Jesus introduces the metaphor. He tells her, "Everyone who drinks this well water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life."
This is the definitive death blow to the literal interpretation of water. By contrasting the well water with his water, he's laying bare the limitation of the physical world. Literal water only solves a temporary cyclical biological deficit.
You drink, your cells utilize the moisture, you perspire, you urinate, and a few hours later, the deficit returns.
You are trapped in a biological loop of thirst and temporary satiation.
So the bucket is a metaphor. The well is a metaphor. The physical thirst she's experiencing is a stand-in for an existential void.
The living water is an influx of truth so profound, a paradigm shift so total, that it permanently resolves that existential deficit. It doesn't mean you stop learning, but it means the fundamental, desperate search for foundational meaning is quenched.
I love that the speaker reads the well encounter like a modern romantic comedy setup, just to show how absurd the literal reading is, before pivoting to that profound point. But then, if you thought the dialogue at the well was awkward when taken literally, the analysis moves to a passage in John chapter 7 that, if taken literally, shifts from awkward comedy to outright biological horror.
Yes, this is where the physical interpretation becomes grotesque. Jesus stands up at a festival and declares, "Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." Or, as older and more literal translations render the Greek anatomy, "out of his belly."
Out of his belly. Now, the analysis doesn't pull any punches here. If you have literal, physical rivers of water bursting out of your stomach, you have not achieved a state of heightened spiritual grace. You have suffered a catastrophic internal rupture.
You are experiencing massive hemorrhaging. You require a doctor immediately, invasive surgery, not a priest.
It is a terrifying medical emergency. The image is absurd, gross, and completely derails any spiritual meaning if your brain is stuck in a literal framework. But the analysis uses this grotesque impossibility to pivot into a fascinating linguistic breakdown of what is actually being described.
This is perhaps the most compelling part of the entire argument. The analysis dives into the linguistics to examine the scale of the metaphor. They look specifically at how these terms translate across different languages, focusing heavily on the Chinese translation of the text.
Break this down, because this distinction completely changes the weight of the verse.
The speaker notes that the text doesn't say a trickle or a small stream of water will flow out of you. In the Chinese translation, the word used for river in this context is jiang, or he terms, reserved for massive, powerful, continent-spanning bodies of water, like the Yangtze or the Yellow River.
Wait, really?
Yes. They contrast this with words used for small, babbling brooks or creeks.
The Greek text does something similar, doesn't it? It uses potamoi, which implies floods or rushing torrents, not a gentle spring.
Exactly. The linguistic scale is massive. So, when the text says rivers of living water will flow from your core, it is describing the possession of an overwhelming, unstoppable, continental scale volume of truth.
It's the difference between having memorized a few nice inspirational quotes you can recite at a dinner party and possessing a fundamental, deep-seated comprehension of reality that is so vast it literally alters the landscape around you.
One is a puddle, the other is the Yangtze River.
It implies a state of being where your understanding is so deep that it cannot be contained internally. It naturally, forcefully flows outward to nourish and reshape the environment and the people around you.
And it flows out of the belly, the koilia in Greek, the innermost being, the seat of human emotion and deepest intuition. It's not just intellectual data stored in the brain. It is truth assimilated into the very core of your identity.
You know, I love how the analysis forces the reader into a corner here. You have two options. You can either believe this text is a literal description of a magical, monstrous anatomical mutation, or you have to accept that it is an intricate, demanding psychological and spiritual map.
There is no compromise between the two. The literal reading creates a monster. The metaphorical reading creates an enlightened mind.
So, We have run the gauntlet. We've looked at the ocean suspended in outer space, the highly selective moral rainstorm, the logistical nightmare of freezing baptisms, the political theater of foot washing, the romantic comedy at the well, and the medical horror of stomach rivers. All of these disparate symbols, all this water. How does the analysis synthesize all of this? What is the final, ultimate takeaway here?
The analysis culminates by defining one of the most debated, ethereal, and misunderstood concepts in all of theology: the Holy Spirit, often referred to as the Spirit of Truth.
This is a concept that usually gets described in incredibly vague, spooky terms: a feeling, a ghost, an emotional swell during a choir performance.
But the analysis rejects all of that mystical vagueness. It posits a brutal binary definition based on the textual evidence we've just reviewed. The argument is that the Holy Spirit is entirely, 100% synonymous with possessing this internal river of living water.
Meaning, it is synonymous with profound internalized truth.
Exactly. The conclusion is stark. If you cannot explain the deep mechanics of these texts, if you do not possess this massive, flowing comprehension of reality, this internal Yangtze river of knowledge, then you do not have the Spirit.
Wow.
It does not matter how many physical rituals you have endured. It doesn't matter if you were fully immersed in a frozen river in Manchuria. It doesn't matter if a head of state washed your feet. It doesn't matter if you cry during the hymns. If your internal architecture lacks this profound truth, you are operating without the Spirit.
That is an incredibly high bar. It strips away all the performative safety nets. And the analysis actually twists the knife a bit here by pointing out that even proximity to the source didn't guarantee this understanding. It notes that the original 12 disciples, the guys who literally walked around with the teacher, did not immediately possess this river of truth in their bellies.
Because truth cannot be transmitted through mere physical proximity or osmosis, the entire lecture is essentially a passionate, unyielding plea for intense textual and spiritual literacy. It argues that knowledge only becomes salvific. It only becomes living water when it is deeply understood, internalized, and applied.
When you take the text literally, you aren't just making a literary mistake. You are, to go back to the beginning of our discussion, actively drinking the dirty water. You are consuming a degraded, polluted version of the narrative that cannot save you, cannot enlighten you, and frankly makes you look a bit ridiculous.
You are eating the menu and wondering why you are still starving.
Let me ask you this as we wrap up this deep dive. By systematically stripping away the literal magic, the sky oceans, the bending rainstorms, the physical healings in the water, does this source ultimately rob the text of its magic? Does it reduce these ancient, sweeping epics to just complicated psychology textbooks?
I would argue the exact opposite. I think the analysis proves that the literal interpretation is actually what robs the text of its power. Believing in a literal magical sky ocean requires nothing but passive childlike credulity. It demands nothing of your intellect.
It's intellectually lazy.
Precisely. But treating the text as an intricate, demanding psychological and spiritual mirror, that requires immense cognitive labor. It forces you to confront your own ignorance, your own biases, and your own existential thirst. It elevates the text from a weird, physically impossible fairy tale into a vital technology for human transformation.
It demands that we actually use our brains to achieve enlightenment, rather than just waiting for magic weather. And the analysis leaves us on a brilliant cliffhanger, too. It teases the next logical lesson: how the 4 rivers of Eden eventually evolve into 12 rivers, representing the 12 disciples carrying this massive flow of truth out into the arid landscape of the wider world.
It shows that the entire ancient text is an interconnected, self-sustaining ecosystem of metaphor.
It is a stunning testament to the power of ancient literary architecture, provided you have the right key to unlock it. Well, thank you for joining us on this incredibly dense, fascinating deep dive. We've traveled from a guy fishing in a literal heaven to localized rainstorms to the biological impossibility of rivers bursting out of abdomens, all to see how easily we mistake profound symbols for literal instruction manuals.
But before we completely sign off, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that pivots this entire concept away from ancient texts and directly into your own immediate reality.
Okay, I like where this is going. Bring it home.
The source challenged us to look at religious rituals, like foot washing or baptism, and see how they devolved into empty, literal, physical performances devoid of their original transformative truth. I want you to look at your own life completely outside the realm of religion or ancient history.
In the secular world.
Yes. Think about the routines you engage in every single day. The corporate buzzwords you use in meetings, the societal traditions you uphold, the daily habits you perform. How many of those started as a profound idea, a genuine pursuit of connection or efficiency, and have now devolved into an empty, literal ritual?
Oh, wow.
Are you attending daily stand-up meetings that are just performative foot washing? Are you repeating cultural catchphrases that have completely lost their internal truth, their living water? Are you, in your own modern, secular, highly sophisticated way, just splashing tap water on your face and pretending you are clean while entirely ignoring the actual state of your internal world?
That is the ultimate diagnostic mirror right there. We're all susceptible to trading the difficult truth for the easy ritual. Keep questioning the water you are consuming in your own life. Make sure it is the real thing, demanding your full intellect and not just a comfortable, dirty illusion. Until next time, stay curious and keep diving deep.